We are back and joined by Rick Carpiniello. He wrote a nice book, The Franchise, New York Rangers, A Curated History of Blueshirts. I'm a big Rangers fan and grew up one here in Connecticut. And, Rick, welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, Rob. Very nice talking to you, and thanks for having me.
All right, so tell me about the Rangers and tell me, growing up in the 70s, tell me before that, why were the Rangers so appealing, especially to me as a young kid playing hockey growing up here on the East Coast? But why have the Rangers kind of always been appealing?
That's a great question. Maybe it's partly because of Madison Square Garden and the excitement of New York City and all that. But I grew up a Ranger fan too, and of course that passed when I became a journalist. But everybody I knew was a Ranger fan. And of course, the Islanders back in the 70s barely existed, right? They came in the late 70s to be a decent team. But, the Devils were still out, and I don't even know if they were in Denver at the time. They probably weren't yet. So, they were, if you wanted hockey, it was the Rangers or pretty much nothing. They had the WHA. Do you remember that at all, Rob?
Oh, yeah.
And then, the Hartford Whalers, who had that great song, that great goal song. But yeah, the Rangers were the team here. I guess in Connecticut it was either the Rangers or the Bruins, right? And and most of us, I think, gravitated toward the Rangers, obviously.
Rick, Ben Darnell here. I'm a huge fan of sports history, and I learned something today of how the Rangers got their name. I don't know if this is a part of the book, and I'm throwing you one right off the bat. You should be an expert in this stuff. Give our listeners the name story and why the Rangers in New York.
Well, because of Tex Rickard, right? I don't recall if that is in the book. It probably is, because my curated history only goes back to 78, 79 when I first started covering. But Tex Rickard owned the team, and they became Tex apostrophe S,
right.
Rangers. So, yeah, they were, the Texas Rangers was a thing. And obviously it became a baseball team and a World Series champion, by the way. But the Rangers were named for Tex. Tex is Rangers. So that's how they got that. How does anybody get anything? How did the Yankees become the Yankees? Why were the Yankees and not the Red Sox? So because the Yankees are the northern folk in most of the country, right? And so yeah, the name it's a funny name for the Rangers, for the New York Rangers, but it's lasted 97 years now, so that's it.
Yeah, and fascinating. I mean, they're one of the original 6 in the NHL. Like I said, I grew up in the 70s loving the Rangers and all of those guys. I was a huge Rangers fan, but also the red, white, and blue, like you said, Madison Square Garden. And they haven't won a lot of championships. Why is that?
No. Yeah, well, first thing, go back to that, too. I think the blue uniform is like one of the best uniforms
absolutely
in sports, right? So I'm sure that attracts people, too. Why they haven't won championships is basically a lot of it is because of dysfunction. And I get into a lot of that dysfunction in my book.
Nice.
I guess the 60s, which was before my time, was pretty dark, pretty bad era. But there were some bad eras from 78, 79 through today. And now they're going on no cups in 30 years this year, and one in 83, or going on one in 84. So there are some dark years and some dark decades even. The years from 1997 when they let Mark Messier go to Vancouver, or when they pushed him to go to Vancouver, through the end of the lockout in 2005, they didn't make the playoffs once. So, that I think that's like the dark ages in my book. In times where they just stunk. They didn't make the playoffs. They didn't do anything. I think there were times, where they didn't win championships in the 70s, certainly in the early 70s, where they were very, very good. And then in the early 80s, they were excellent. They couldn't get by the Islanders, who were in a dynasty. In the 90s, they finally won one. Then they fell off the planet for 7 years. And then they were pretty good again in the 2010s. So, but the fact that they couldn't break through and win one is why it's one in 83 years, and why it's going to be 1 in 84 if they don't win this year.
Rick, are you trying to tell me you have no belief in the 1940 curse of the New York Rangers? From what I hear, they burnt a lease in the Stanley Cup, and it upset the hockey gods until 1994. That doesn't hit your equation of why they were so bad during those dark times?
No, we talk about the curse quite a bit in the book, too. I mean, there's certainly that curse. They burned the mortgage. They burned the mortgage in the Stanley Cup after they won in 1940. And
that's the mortgage for the Garden, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Or maybe it was their lease, but yeah. So that was historic, an historic curse, and that's the one they busted in 1994. But a lot of people think that was it, just like they thought the Billy Goat was the reason the Cubs didn't win, and Babe Ruth's trade to New York was the reason the Red Sox didn't win all those years. People believe in curses, and there's a lot of reasons to believe in that. But yeah, for sure. But in reality, the curse was certainly helped along by a lot of dysfunction, a lot of poor management, a lot of selling the future for now, which they did a lot. They took a lot of swings and misses. I remember Phyllis Vito coming in as the general manager and declaring enough waiting and just making trade after trade after trade, trying to win a Stanley Cup. I think they've taken a lot of swings. Even recently with Glenn Sather in the 2000s, he took a bunch of swings, traded draft picks after draft picks. For years, they didn't have a first-round draft pick, and that's why they got passed by teams, because they didn't draft well, and sometimes they didn't draft at all. So there's certainly a reason to believe in the curse if you like that kind of thing, and I don't totally dismiss it, but there's also dysfunction, and we see it too with the New York Football Jets, who haven't won since 69, and the New York Knicks, who haven't won since 73. It's not just the Rangers, and dysfunction plays a big part in that.
Talking to Rick Carpiniello, he wrote the book, The Franchise, New York Rangers, A Curated History of the Blueshirts and Their History. Take us back before the 70s. Like you said, the 60s were dark, even farther back when they were part of the original six. What was hockey like back in like the 30s, 40s, even during World War II?
Well, I don't know. Honestly, I don't. I started following them in the early 70s, maybe 68, 69, but 16 league where the guys took trains to their road games.
Unreal.
Both teams would travel on the same train sometimes when they play home and home series. It must have been bizarre, right?
Yeah.
But I was nowhere near it. And again, this curated history begins in 78, 79. My first year, when I was a young man, and they went to the Stanley Cup final and played and almost beat the Montreal Canadiens, who were going for their fourth straight cup. So, that's really where, my area of expertise starts in 78, 79.
What are your thoughts? And we always talk about this just being kind of an anomaly. When we talk about the dysfunction that you mentioned that the Rangers were going through, and we bring that to the New York Knicks, we point at the head guy in James Dolan. James Dolan also owns the New York Rangers. And we always say, how does he not screw up the Rangers as bad as he screws up the Knicks? Now, are we right on that, or what are your thoughts on Dolan's role in the recent success and non-success of the New York Rangers?
Yeah, well, he came in right after the Cup, so he had nothing to do with that. And I will say this about Dolan, and I've said this often about Glenn Sather, too, who was the GM for whatever it was, 16 years or something. The greatest thing he's ever done, and this is a guy who's won 5 Stanley Cups in Edmonton and is in the Hockey Hall of Fame as a builder and has a resume that's unbelievable. But I think the greatest thing he's ever done was to keep Dolan's hands off the Rangers, because Dolan hired Sather, gave him a job for life, and trusted him implicitly because Dolan does not know hockey. So I think Sather keeping Dolan away from the hockey team was one of the greatest things he's ever accomplished. And while he was, his hands were off the operation, he was a pretty good owner because he had money and he wasn't afraid to spend it. Before the salary cap, that was a huge advantage for the Rangers. And after the salary cap, he was still able to give them money to buy out players, to get out of contract, get out of bad contract, to get under the salary cap when other teams couldn't. They couldn't afford to buy out a player and pay 6 years of salary off the books, off the salary cap books. But Dolan would allow them to do it. Dolan built them a practice facility with the Knicks. Dolan let them fly first class hotels, charter aircraft, everything done, top of the line, and he treats the team great. So in those regards, he was a good owner. But then Dolan started putting his hands back into the operation a few years ago, and they've been bouncing around a little bit since then. So I think that he hasn't been as involved as he is with the Knicks, certainly. And he hasn't gotten it wrong as much as he has with the Knicks, as far as the Rangers are concerned.
What about GMs that have tenure? You were talking about Sather and run an organization. I know you commented on Brian Cashman and his rant at the GM meetings. Your thoughts on why Hal Steinbrenner has kept Brian Cashman so long?
That's, to me, I don't know. I honestly don't know. He's a loyal, from what I understand, and I don't know how at all. He's a loyal guy. And sometimes loyalty can get in your way in sports, certainly. We know that. Sometimes loyalty is really good, too. Sometimes, you don't fire a manager or a coach just because of bad season. Sometimes you see, the real picture, the big picture. But how? I don't know that. I don't know. I think, what Cashman's done in the last few years has been bizarrely bad. It just, acquisition after acquisition, decision after decision. And that team last year wasn't just bad. It was unwatchable.
Yeah.
Absolutely unwatchable.
Yep.
And if anybody is ever going to get fired, especially in New York, you would think last year, the last Yankee season would be it. It would be the reason to fire someone. And I'm not saying Cashman's a terrible GM. No, I think he's had certainly a lot of good years. But what happened last year, if there's ever a fireable offense, that was it. And I don't understand or know why he's untouchable and Aaron Boone is also untouchable. I don't get that at all. And again, Boone probably could not have done much better with what they had, but what they had was awful last year. Just unwatchable.
Take me back to 1994, sir, when you have been covering this team now for close to 30 years, or 20 years at that point, and they finally break through and they finally do beat Vancouver in a 7-game series to the Stanley Cup Finals, and the place goes just bonkers. I remember the night when they finally win this. I don't have any idea what the city was like when they finally got the Stanley Cup back in New York. Take me back to that time when the Rangers finally do break through.
Yeah, well, first of all, the city's on pins and needles, right? Because they were up 3-1 in that series, and they lose Game 5 at home with the cup in the house. Then they go back up to Vancouver and lose Game 6. So now it's do or die, right? And now you could be talking at 0 for 83 now. It's 0 for 83 instead of 1 for 83. And the city's on pins and needles. The Garden's loud, almost as loud as I've ever heard it. The loudest I've ever heard it was 79 against the Islanders. But the Garden's loud, but you can also feel in the building that these people are nervous as hell. Some of them, almost nauseously nervous. Glenn Healy, the backup goalie, said that at that night that 8 million people have already dialed the 9 and the 1 and are ready to dial the 7 1. So that's the feeling in the building. It's palpable. But when they win it, and what Mark Messier, meant to this city, what he meant to that team, what he meant to the franchise, changed the franchise. His first thing was, we're sharing this cup with the city. And the city was on its best behavior that night. The city was wild, but there was no rioting. There was, no reported rioting anyway. We didn't see anything. There were no cars overturned or looting. None of the stuff that happens in a lot of other cities happened in New York. And I was lucky enough to be invited to go to the auction house on the Upper East Side where the Rangers were having their team party. And it was a blocked off cross street, barricaded, so no cars. There were just people, and you couldn't see the sidewalk or the street because of the people were, 30, 40 wide across the street. And as well-behaved as you could possibly be, and people crying with happiness, Esa Tikkanen took the Stanley Cup outside the auction house onto a porch, handed it down to the fans. It went halfway down the block and came back. It's like, could you imagine that's what could have happened? Anything could have happened to the Stanley Cup. It could have disappeared for good. But it went down the block and came back and was handed back to Tikkanen.
Wow.
Like, that was how they shared the Stanley Cup with New York City, with fans that had, cried for it and people who suffered through this long drought, this 54-year drought. The parade was sensational, and I saw a sign that said, my grandfather thanks you, my father thanks you, and I thank you. It was just an outpouring of love, but also the Rangers made sure that this was a cup for New York and not just for the team, not just for the players, and the cup was everywhere that summer. The cup took a beating, too, that summer. And that's why now there are so-called keepers of the cup, guys whose full-time job is to stay with the Stanley Cup as it's celebrated throughout the summer with each team, because the cup was beaten to crap. Joey Kosar talks about having it soldered, having to solder the bowl back onto the top of the cup. Eddie Olczyk had a horse, stick his snout in there. Eddie said he didn't eat out of it, actually, but it was the Kentucky Derby winner.
Awesome.
At the Belmont, they put some hay in the cup, and they let him stick his nose in there for photos. And sure enough, so the cup was everywhere, and it took a beating, but it was celebrated and it was shared by the whole city, and it really was.
Somebody should write a book about where the cup has been, because I know it's been to a lot of crazy places.
Yeah, it sure has. I've been in Mario Lemieux's pool. There's a story about what team, I forget, was the Maple Leafs or the Canadians. A bunch of them were going out with it, and they got a flat tire, and they took everything out of the trunk, including the cup, to change the tire. Then they took off and left it on the side of the road. There's a book, too, called If the Cup Could Talk. A friend of mine, Mike Brophy, wrote it a long time ago, and there's some anecdotes in there about where that thing's been. And
I got to get that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Rick, thank you so much for a few minutes of your time. Can't wait to get a copy of the book and read it. Rick Carpiniello, everybody, and we enjoyed sharing a few minutes with you today.
Thank you for letting me talk about it. I really appreciate it, and really enjoyed it. Thanks, guys.
All right, good luck. The book's called The Franchise New York Rangers, A Curated History of the Blueshirts. When we come back, Bob Joyce gets you fired up for UConn women's basketball versus the Dayton Flyers at the XL, coming up at 7:05.